but I wanted to introduce you to David Bonderman. Most people know David for his role in as a private equity investor, the legendary founder of TPG Capital, and we will go back to that in a moment. If you're a sports fan, maybe you know David for his participation in the NBA's Boston Celtics or the future National Hockey League team in Seattle. And if you're into music, maybe you have been to one of his parties. I'm lucky to know David as a friend. He's brutally transparent. I also know him for his commitment to the environment, his anti-poaching efforts, his expertise in Islam law, and which only matches his education in gelato. He's a gelato sommelier. And to say that David is authentic is an understatement. His sarcasm can be always an experience. In fashion, he's a trendsetter in whatever is most comfortable with complete disregard for how it looks. His socks are always, let's say, unexpected. He has a well-synchronized radar for bullshit, an infuriating sharp mind, an enviable memory for details, dates, geography, a passion for traveling and learning. He enjoys sharing, although not words. So I'll make my best effort to extract some of those answers from him in this session. Thank you, David, for agreeing to be with us in this amazing conference that Michael Healy put together.
After that introduction, we better go home now before it gets worse.
So David, I think that in this session we have a group of different, from different nationalities, backgrounds, fields and industries. And what brings us together, I think, is our desire to reinvent the future. And you were a pioneer in the world of private equity, and you did so by identifying an opportunity in Continental Airlines. Why don't you tell us about that opportunity and how it came to be, and maybe what we can all learn, what are the lessons that we can apply into our own fields?
Well, Continental was a complex situation. The airline, which was the 5th biggest in the United States at the time, and a big business, had gone bankrupt twice because of the fact that the industry leaders were leading the industry in the wrong direction. And the financial community had been pretty tired of bailing out this airline for two round trips to bankruptcy. And everybody was so down on the industry in general and the particular case of Continental that nobody bothered to look at the facts. And there was no equity, no private equity firms in those days. It was all hedge fund operators and a few corporate raiders, as they were termed. And we took a look at the numbers, and we figured out that 2 years before it went bankrupt, Continental made $900 million that year. And then they made a few mistakes, and the cycle turned against them because the airlines is a cyclical business. So we thought that if you got a proper management and behaved reasonably with respect to the unions who hated the management, the numbers might be overwhelmingly good. And that's what it turned out to be. There was no competition, literally, because nobody had any faith that you could turn this airline around. And we knew little enough to know what we didn't know, which was plenty. So we jumped into the fray, and it worked out all right. To do that, we spent all of our time for several years helping manage the company. We installed a new management, and we got lucky in the sense that the aviation cycle turned while we were doing this, just in time to rescue us from having a possible third bankruptcy. And that's what made our reputation from the start. That was our first deal on our own.
How successful was that deal?
Depends how you measure success. In real human terms, Continental had 40,000 employees, all of whom were going to lose their jobs. Continental went under again. And we had to reduce the payroll by 4,000 to keep the company viable, but ultimately wound up with 52,000 employees. So that was one good thing that happened. Second good thing that happened is that we made 10 times our money in 3 years on a $100 million investment, more or less. So that kind of put us on the map.
So let's talk about how you came to this deal and starting TPG. So you grew up in Los Angeles, and then you moved to Seattle, where you got your undergraduate degree. Then you went to Harvard Law School, and all normal up to there. Shortly after, you traveled to Cairo in Egypt to study Islamic legal jurisprudence on law. And can you tell us about that experience and why Egypt and why Islamic law? Did you think you were going to be a scholar in this area?
Well, sort of. These were the days when it was a lot of people, myself included, decided they didn't want to go into the Army. So I had a possibility of a deferment if I stayed in school or did something scholarly. And at the same time, Harvard was looking for somebody to teach Islamic law. And they had in mind me, since I just graduated from the law school and I knew some Arabic. And so I agreed to take a fellowship to learn Islamic law. I spent a year in Cairo and a year in Tunis. This was when Nasser was still alive, and it was a pretty interesting place. And so I spent 2 years studying Arabic in Cairo and Tunis. The people who gave me the grant that made this possible was Harvard Law School and the Ford Foundation. And so I spent 2 years in the Middle East with the expectation of doing something when I returned. But when I returned, I concluded I didn't want to be a teacher, although I did teach for 1 year. That wasn't my métier. It was fun, it was interesting, but I didn't want to be a long-term teacher. So I decided to go practice law instead of going on with Islamic law.
And then you came back to the US and started working with the US Attorney General. Can you tell us who this was and what did you did for him or her? Yeah,
so the Attorney General at the time was Ramsey Clark, whose father, Tom Clark, was on the Supreme Court, had been on the Supreme Court. And this was in the Johnson administration. I got a job as a special assistant, as it was called, to the head of the Civil Rights Division. So I spent 2 years in the Civil Rights Division, mainly dealing with racial discrimination cases in Mississippi and Alabama. And I did that for 2 years, which was a great job, doing good by doing good at a time of extreme racial problems. It was a great job. And then Richard Nixon got elected and suddenly became less of a good job. So I left to practice law.
That's when you joined the firm in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes.
And so it was then when you had to argue your case against the Supreme Court?
That was five years later, as I've been practicing. I wound arguing a case in the Supreme Court. It was actually the last thing I did before I stopped practicing law.
And what happened in that case?
In that case, my client, who was a guy who immortalized in the Supreme Court, Lord, I think Ray Dirks, who discovered a major fraud in company called Equity Funding, which was a Wall Street darling based in Beverly Hills. And he figured out it was a fraud. And he went and told all his clients that there was a fraud. And some of them bought, some of them sold. Nobody could figure out exactly what was going on. But when the whole thing came apart, the SEC decided to prosecute Mr. Dirks for disseminating inside information when he tried to get the SEC to listen to this fraud, and the SEC wouldn't pay any attention to it. Anyway, the case went all the way to Supreme Court, and I lost it in the administrative law judges' chambers, lost it in the DC circuit, and won it in the Supreme Court. And it was a great experience to be able to do that.
Wow. Not all the lawyers have the story to tell that they went into the Supreme Court and won a case. So you then joined the Bass Family Group, where I think, if I'm correct, you became the chief of the COO. And it was during that time that you decided to buy Continental Airlines, correct?
I worked with Bob Bass for 10 years. And towards the end of that 10 years was when the Continental deal was around. Bob hated the deal because he thought that no matter what happened, he would get vilified in the press. Either Continental would fail again, and he would be thought to be the person who caused it to have its third and final disaster, or it would be a success, in which case the pilots would all complain that he was making money when they should be. A problem in the aviation business. So Bob didn't like that deal at all. But then all of a sudden, after being a great partner for 10 years, Bob decided that the end of the world was nigh, and what happened in the major recessions was about to happen, and decided he didn't want to be in business anymore. And he certainly didn't want to have anything to do with Continental Airlines. So my partner, Jim Coulter, and I left, and we did the Continental Airlines on ourselves. And I always remember meeting with Claude Taylor, who was the chairman and CEO of Air Canada, who are our partner, on the theory it would be nice to have somebody in the deal who knew anything about the airline business. I flew up to Toronto to meet Mr. Taylor, who had been agreed to put $100 million into the deal for Air Canada under the Bass aegis. And I said to Claude when I got there, I got good news and bad news, which is the good news is we're all authorized to go forward and put up our share of the money. The bad news is it's Coulter and myself who are the partner. And if Bob Bass isn't going to be in this deal, Claude looked at me and said, I never met Bob Bass, but I met you and I like you and you could do the deal. Go get him. And that was in business.
So up until this moment, you've been working in a lawyer's office. Everything seems to be normal. And you call your parents and you tell them, so what are you doing? They ask you, what are you doing? And you say, no, I'm buying an airline. What did they have to say about you buying an airline?
Nothing.
Perplexed.
Well, my father was deceased. And my mother was not into business.
Okay. So for those in the call who are not well versed in finance, what is can you tell us what is the difference between venture capital and private equity? What's the important consideration? Is it risk? Is it time of the investment?
The nature of the risk.
Okay.
Although at the edges, the two art forms bleed into each other, but at their core, venture capital guys will take risks on new businesses where there is no track record, and often just an idea. and they make a judgment about what you can make happen with that idea or that small business. Private equity guys look at established businesses where the issues are quality of the management, quality of the business, and your ability to affect change or to recognize a better business than the market sees. The nature of the businesses are such that, and to be a successful venture capitalist, you have to make many investments because most of them won't work. Be a successful private equity guy, you have to make most of the management, most of the businesses work. Otherwise, you'll be out of business.
Okay. When you bought Continental, I remember this story that you were flying the first time, or one of the first times in one of the planes, and you tried the food. Can you tell us that story of how you managed it with the CEO?
Yeah. So when we bought Continental Airlines, we needed somebody who knew how to run the business, we thought, to become CEO when I became chairman, to manage the board and the investment. And you can't understate the difficulty of turning around a business with 42,000 employees. It's like turning a battleship. It's hard to do that. Even if you put your own people in at the top, it takes a while for new methods to take place. And Coulter and I and our wives were in Lyon, in Mexico, on a brief holiday. And we were flying back, and we had 2 seats, each in first class. And they served a meal, as airlines did in those days. One doesn't remember that anymore, but in the old days, got a free meal, so-called. And the meal they served was a steak, which looked like a pair of shoes. You couldn't cut it with a knife. Anyway, I took the platter and I put it in a Federal Express bag, and I fed it to the CEO, saying, "Is this the kind of meal that you really want to see?" And of course, the CEO fired the catering guy, who was no doubt on the take, this being Mexico. But you had to do some things to sort of shake up the management. And there are numerous things that had to be done or that we chose to do. I'll give you one example. Was when people wrote a letter to Continental complaining, and people wrote letters in those days, there was no internet, they'd get a form letter back with no return address or name on it. So there was no one for them to be able to contact to follow up with their complaint. And so we made them throw out the stationery and put new stationery in, which was signed by whoever was responding. And it upset the long-term employees no end, that they'd have to take responsibility for making their own decisions about what to give somebody for a ticket or a discount for having screwed up before. And there's some plenty colorful stories about what we went through trying to turn this.
So then one of the investments that you've made was in Ryanair, which I understand has been successful, and I'm talking about pre-COVID. But we've talked about how interesting it has been, but also how interesting it has been to deal with the CEO, who is a very interesting person. Can you tell us a little bit about what Ryanair is, who the CEO is, and how do you see the airline industry moving into this post-COVID world?
Well, let me talk something about the latter first. The Europeans have taken a different view than the US about what to do about the airlines, all of whom are suffering from lack of passengers. The Europeans, where Ryanair operates, have shut down all airline traffic except for a few rescue flights. So they've left the airlines with no capacity, no way to obtain revenues. But the expenses are still there. So the Europeans have put up funds of multiple $1 billion to give the airlines money to pay pilots and flight attendants and mechanics so they don't have to lay them off. But the governments are basically paying the tab. The US has done something that is the opposite, which is they've insisted that the airlines keep flying even though no one wants to fly on. And they're paying some part of that with the $35 billion exposure for the government. But they're forcing the airlines to fly as a way to keep the pilots and others employed. Whereas what they should have done is what the Europeans have done, which is pay the pilots directly and don't make the airlines fly, which is just causing bigger losses. So that's what's going on at the moment. What will happen is weaker airlines, which there are a number in Europe, will go under. The stronger airlines will come out battered but okay. In Ryanair's case, they have $4.5 billion of cash, so they're in a position to weather the storm better than anyone else. The U.S. air carriers have greater losses and may not have enough money out of the $35 billion to stay in business. So we'll see. As for Ryanair's CEO, his name is Michael O'Leary. He's perhaps the best CEO of any company we've had, certainly one of the best. And also shows you the serendipityness of it all, because he never set out to be a CEO of anything, let alone the airline business. He was a junior accountant when the guy who then owned a Ryanair, who was a guy named Tony Ryan, picked him to run what was then a very small Irish carrier with 3 or 4 planes. And O'Leary took one look at business that he'd been brought in to count the numbers on and concluded the business was going to fail and that the business model didn't work. So he went searching around for another business model, and he found it in Southwest Airlines, based in Texas. Remember, Ryanair is based in Dublin, Ireland. And he came back and switched the airline to an ultra low cost carrier, and it took off, and the value of the airline went from about $12 million to about $18 billion at the high point. All along the way, O'Leary became legendary for his colorful and somewhat unprintable, or often unprintable, advertising motifs.
And do you think, I mean, this is a moment in which, is it a moment to back out of airlines, or are you seeing opportunity to buy more?
There will be opportunity when things stabilize.
Okay, so let's go into what might happen next in terms of what is the next wave of disruption. You've invested in very transformative companies that have redefined industries, and everything that it's being talked about, WeWork, the challenges of Uber, the postponed IPO of Airbnb. What lessons can investors and entrepreneurs learn so that they can adapt for this next wave of innovative companies? How do you spot them? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are always innovative companies, and spotting them is not so difficult. What is the difficult piece is figuring out which ones are likely to be successful. We see young people in particular with lots of ideas. They cross my desk, or would it be desk if I had one, all the time. The question that's hard to judge is there a business plan that will work? And can you raise the financing to do? There's no good one good answer. There's a myriad of choices. And it turns out that if you look at what's happened, the most successful venture firms are very few. You've got maybe a dozen firms that have been consistently good in the venture space, and about the same many in the PE space. It turns out to be a bit of a knack for people to get these judgments right. And it's basically a judgment call. And some guys have been consistently successful, and others have not. Most others have not. The internet wave has brought a lot of people along, most of whom fail. You don't hear about. But a few people have been consistent. You've got firms like Sequoia and Andreessen who have made a great living out of venture capital. Look to the future, jump in before there's a business model that you know works. Most others who've tried it have not had the right skill set or the right temperament. And I think it'll continue to be the case. But on bottom, it's all about the nature of risk.
Talking about media, it is, or it has gone to a dramatic transformation. What are your thoughts about the streamers, more specifically Spotify versus radio, Netflix versus broadcast TV and cable? What are your thoughts on that moving forward?
It's going to be complete chaos for a while as the industry readjusts to the new. You've got, so far, there's been winners and losers. Look at Zoom, whose client base went from 10 million to 300 million in a month. It's not the kind of thing you have in the real world. Look at some college kid who like to take pictures of undergraduate friends running the second biggest company in the world. Who'd have thunk it? But the one thing is that all of those kinds of businesses are run by people of the same cohort age-wise. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about that called Outliers. There was an opening, and people who were innovative and young and not attached to anything else took it. And so you've got Google, Facebook, Tencent, JD. Whereas the people who should have done that were the wrong age, the wrong background, the wrong risk for that kind of a business. And that's, I think, the great lesson of life here.
We're going to do 10 more minutes of questions, and then we're going to open it to the room. So I wanted to ask you, TPG has an investment in Ducati, the motorcycles.
No longer. We weren't smart enough to keep it.
But did you ever try their bikes?
I did. We bought Ducati. It's probably a dozen years ago now, and ultimately sold it to BMW. After fixing it, it was a great machine, marvelously made, with Italian specialty looks, etc. But a corrupt and incompetent management team. And so we managed to buy it and fix it. And every other year, Ducati had a Ducati World Weekend. Once every other year in Ravenna and every other year in Las Vegas. And anybody who had a Ducati was welcome to come. There's a fair and food and drink, which matched better with Ducati than you might imagine. I rode a motorcycle from downtown out to the racetrack in Las Vegas, to the racetracks in North Las Vegas. So that was the last venture on a Ducati, but it was a fun place.
What about Fender? I think that you sold already your interest in Fender, but you have a very interesting collection of guitars. Which one is your favorite?
Mick Jagger, of course.
Of course. There's already people clapping in the audience. Let's talk about how you invest in the unknown. You were or still are a shareholder in Kite Pharmaceutical, and which was bought by Gilead Sciences for 11.9 billion in an all-cash deal. And I want to ask you how you came into this deal, and why do you decided to invest in something that was difficult to predict?
Well, the brains behind the operation of Kite is a PhD, Harry Beldergren, who has started 6 companies, all of them successfully. Kite was actually one of the earliest ones. And he and I were on vacation together, and he said, I have this idea, but I don't know what to do with it. I want to start a business, but I don't know how to do that either. So we chatted. Turned out the idea was a cure for blood cancer. It's called immunotherapy now, which was very much out of favor and very much not something that was easy to raise money for. So I helped Ari to start the company, which is how I got involved. And we've since done other ones together. And I was the lead director once we went public. So that's one where we sort of started with an idea, which is not what we normally do at TPG. And in fact, it wasn't done in TPG, which doesn't have a venture arm at the time. The science, bottom line.
For those entrepreneurs who are in the call, who are building companies, tell us about what you've learned about finding talent. What for you are the lessons about hiring and firing, and what is the best way to hire and the best way to, or when is the best moment to fire?
Well, the easy question is, when is the best moment to fire? There's never a good moment to fire because it's dislocational. But as George Roberts and KKR said to me when I asked him when we first went into the business, said, George, what's your secret? He said, the secret is when you think you have a problem, you do. When you figure it out, finally, you'll find out that everybody else at the company knew it already and you're the last to find out. And that's basically true.
Yeah.
It's hiring people is hard. It's hard for anybody. It's firing people when they've tried to do a job and haven't succeeded. But you have to step up and do it. Sooner always better than later. And I've now forgotten the first half of the question.
No, it's good. Let's talk about success and wealth, and did you always plan to be wealthy, or did you plan to? How was that process, and what is the? I think what is the secret to success for anyone who you would advise looking back at your life?
Well, there were times you could have made better decisions. So I never started out to be wealthy, and money was never part of the idea. I originally thought I was going to be an archaeologist. I worked for 2 summers as an archaeologist when I was in college. And it was only the need to stay out of the Army that kept me in school and led me to be a lawyer first and a businessman second. My advice to people is to don't do it for the money. Do it for the love of whatever you're doing, because you won't be successful, at least as a human being, if all you're in it is for the money. Obviously, you have choices to make. If you're going to be a teacher, you're not going to make, but you're going to do working for some venture capital firm. So it's got to be something you love, or at least like a lot, and something that you've got a skill set for. And the other point of it is life is serendipitous. Opportunities come along by accident or just in the scheme of things. And the real difference between the successful entrepreneur and the unsuccessful one is knowing when to take the leap and jump off the bridge.
And so give us an idea of what are 3 principles that for you have held in true along your life and that have been like the bastions to make the decisions. What are 3 things that you always at least feel that are there to keep the course going?
You're talking about in a business sense?
In a personal sense.
In a personal sense? Well, part of it is doing something you like and something you're good at. Surround yourself with people who are at least as smart or not smarter than you are, and people who you like. And remember that person you want to take home to meet mom is not necessarily the person you want to have running your company. Don't confuse friends with business acumen.
That's great. Difficult question, David. Should billionaires pay more taxes, or they should pay their fair share? What is your view on taxes?
My view on taxes is that we have a fucked up tax structure. People should pay their fair share, and we have too much tax benefits going to the wealthy and not enough to the middle class. That's why you have all this turmoil that we have here. And given the current administration, it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
All right, my last question has to do with the outlook of where we are, and it's hard to make projections of what's coming, but somebody speaks up. I mean, some people speak about the new normal, and what are your thoughts? What's coming? How can you think about a future where everything has changed so much?
Well, that's a very good question. We live in an exceptionally turbulent and unpredictable time. 50 years from now, it's going to be like how we look back on the 60s and all the turmoil, Vietnam and racial discrimination, and the financial markets. 50 years from now, they're going to look at these few years as something just as exceptional. This time not caused by anything except the virus, which means it's harder to deal with. But there will be a new normal. The real short-term question is whether there's a second and third wave of this virus, which most of the pundits think there will be, which will cause huge dislocations. We've already got 25% of the population of the United States on unemployment, which is higher than the Great Depression in the 30s. There's a lot of adjustment. At the same time, the market's flying. discounting all of this stuff. Both can't be right. But on the other hand, people don't like being cooped up in their apartments for a month at a time. And you're going to see, I think, people violate common sense to get out of the house. And it's going to probably lead to more difficulties, or at least has that potential. So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. But one thing you know is that it's unpredictable.
Well, David, thanks. I'm going to open it to the room. I have no idea how this is going to work, but I guess I'm not sure if everyone can unmute themselves if they want. If you want to ask a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it.
David, are you happy with your investment in CAA?
Very, thank you. CAA has turned out to be a very interesting investment. EBITDA has tripled during our ownership, so we've been pleased with that. We like the people as well. And of course, it's going to have some challenges given the virus and the new normal, but so far so good.
Hi, David. Roberto St. Malo here from Madrid. A pleasure to listen to you. Thanks, Juan. Juan mentioned your environmental activities, initiatives, concerns. Could you share a little bit about how you're active on this front? Please.
Sure, Roberto, thank you for asking. My main environmental cause is anti-poaching in Africa, where my foundation called the Wildcat Fund has operations in 12 countries, all dealing with anti-poaching, ranging from supporting rangers in national parks to supporting judges and prosecutors to prosecute people who are caught poaching. I also do a lot in the Southwest, where I fell in love with the archaeology in the 60s and worked as an archaeologist, as I mentioned before I decided to go to law school.
Thanks.
David, is there an investment or a company that you regret not being able to acquire?
We've done a number of them. But by and large, I've been happy with our portfolio.
David, how would you describe your leadership style?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How could you describe your leadership style?
How would I describe my leadership style? I would hope it's just not too serious. Everybody's got their own style, of course, and you find that in your CEOs. There's no right person, but by and large, I want to be not too serious about it, and of course, delegate a lot.
Hi, David. This is Alfredo Castellanos from Mexico City. Could you share with us which you consider the 3 most important attributes in a CEO?
The most important is the ability to motivate people. There's no particular personality. Some people do it with a whip. Some people do it with a lollipop. But it's got to be an ability to motivate people and to engender trust. But as I say, there's no single type of personality. And sometimes you'll find a guy or a woman who is a great CEO, but not a very good person. And you have to learn to live with that.
Thank you.
David, going back to your efforts in your anti-poaching efforts in Africa, how did you got sensitized with that cause and what brought you into those organizations? I know that you have a view of what really works on the ground and what doesn't, who does really good marketing and who is really effective. So can you tell us how you came sensitized to the issue, but also how you ended up choosing the organization that you were going to support?
Well, I went to Africa the first time 50 years ago and kind of fell in love with the landscape and the people. I've been going back ever since. I've probably been there 50 times, maybe more. As climate change changes the environment in which the animals live, and the huge population growth does the same, it seemed to me one of the things of potential loss would be endangered species in Africa, where there was no consolidating effort to rescue them, which is a complicated situation, at least a combination of taking care of the people involved, but having the, sort of an iron fist with poaching. So we started about 6, 7, 8 years ago now. We started the Wildcat Foundation in order to do this in an organized way. And I recruited a guy named Roger Schlickeisen, who used to run Defenders of Wildlife, to put it together. And between us, we've done that and become probably the largest donor to anti-poaching in Africa. That's how I got there. And we'll keep on it while we can.
Thank you. Here's a question from Joanna Riquet, who is based in Mexico City. The recently released Michael Moore's documentary, Planet of the Humans, has been very controversial on our fossil fuel dependency versus green alternatives. Overall, I think the film leaves you with some loss of hope. For a person that doesn't understand the powerful business interests, do you think a change in the way we consume, the way we live is possible?
It's possible. The question is whether we'll do it. I think over time we're going to be forced to. The current administration is setting us back in every possible way in the United States. Same is true in Brazil. But we have to. Either that or there's going to be no air left to breathe in a few generations. So don't give up the ship, pick it.
Okay, another one from Anik Wolf in New York. How do you see the next 12 months evolving for the sports, media, and technology industry that depend on collaboration to both produce and consume the products?
That's a very good question, one that we spent some time thinking about given our sports interests. Given the amount of money involved, particularly with the NFL, there's going to be some accommodations made. Maybe for starters, games with no spectators, but given the nature of the TV revenues, there's going to be sports. The NFL is planning to have a football game in September, in any case with or without spectators because of the power of the TV rights. And I think we're going to see a fair amount of that happening in midterm, maybe a year from now.
Thanks. A question from Carlos Alfaro in Los Angeles. CEOs today are evaluated for the decisions that favor the shareholders and the share price, while there is much less incentive to take decisions that help society and the environment. In your view, how should a CEO balance these two?
Well, that's an interesting question because it's an issue that's just being raised. It used to be that corporate leaders were supposed to look out for all their constituencies. And then about 40 years ago, some conservative philosophers taking up the field, people began to believe that the only duty is to the shareholders, or if the shareholders are out of it, the creditors. There's beginning to be discussion that that's not the right answer anymore. And there's some cases in Delaware which are trying to deal with that issue, Delaware being the jurisdiction of most choice for corporate America. And I think that's an issue you're going to see a whole lot of, and a whole lot of change driven by US pension funds. There's going to be a whole lot of change in these issues.
Thanks. So question from Memo Chavez in Mexico City. What will be the destiny of your wealth after you are no longer in planet Earth?
My kids and my wife will have to decide what to do with it.
Okay.
It's a chore, but it's pleasurable.
Here's a question. It says, Disney, thoughts on them being acquired by somebody like Apple?
Who being acquired by?
Disney, the Walt Disney Company being acquired by a big player or a bigger player like Apple?
No, it could happen.
Okay. We have like 5 more minutes. See if we get other questions coming in. What's your take on the cannabis legalization at a federal level, and do you think it will happen before the election?
0 chance of it happening before the election.
Okay.
It'll happen someday, but nowhere.
We're not sure if there's going to be election.
Not before the election. The only thing you're going to see before the election is lots of stimulus in the financial sense. Lots of checks with the name Donald Trump at the bottom sent around to people.
So I have one personal question. What's your idea of perfect happiness?
No one has ever asked me that question before. I suppose being 35 and knowing what I know now.
Okay. Here's another one. STX has some ups and downs. Do you see them being acquired?
Well, I don't know if you've seen the news. It's just merged with a company called EOS. Which so it's going, when the deal closes, it will be public. So that's what the near future holds.
Okay, here's 2 more. What's your opinion on the possibility of using VC type of advanced technologies to make private equity-backed industries to run more efficiently, and what are the advantages and disadvantages?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one, and we can have that person relate again. Speaking of management styles, would you share your opinion on Elon Musk's style, at least the public one, like tweeting today that Tesla shares are overpriced?
Elon Musk is a force of nature. He's a brilliant guy in a lot of respects. Compliance with the security laws is not one of them.
If
So
you were this, okay.
So he will get in trouble again from time to time because he doesn't pay any attention to the rules. And in the corporate and engineering sense, that has served him well. Doesn't serve him so well when he's dealing with the SEC.
David,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
I'm 35 and I want to know, what do you know that I don't?
that's a longer conversation.
We have 5 minutes. Make it short and sweet.
Well, I've looked at a lot of companies and a lot of deals in a lot of places. And you get a feel for what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And that's something that comes with time and experience.
Thank you.
Here's one. This I think the last question. If you were the CEO of the U.S., what steps would you take now in anticipation for additional waves of the pandemic and more devastation to come?
Well, I would pay some attention to the science. I would look to get testing in place as it should be, and making use of the testing, and not worry about my personal popularity. And of course, in so many fields, you reverse what these guys have done.
David, last question. There's 2 more minutes. So how have you set, this is from Tere Perez in Mexico City, how have your setbacks and failures shaped your risk-taking attitude and learning?
How do I do my risk-taking what?
How have your setbacks and failures shaped your risk-taking attitude and learning?
Well, hopefully your failures, and we've had a few, are a learning situation where you make something to know that you didn't know beforehand, but also not to be too scared by your failures. If you don't take any risks, you can't fail. But if you don't take any risks, you can't do well either. So it's a question of how you self-examine your appetite for risk. And as you get older, your appetite for risk tends to go down. I've tried to avoid that. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time. I know that you must have a very, very busy schedule these days.